My name is Anne-Rose Keith Achepohl. I'm the Chief Curator of Collections, and I'm so pleased to be able to present to you three of the wonderful collectors who very graciously lent us objects from their personal collections for this current special exhibition in celebration of our 80th anniversary, entitled Living Legacies. We have three people that we know very well here today. In fact, we will hear from three distinguished speakers, all of whom are not only collectors, but also either current or former members of the museum's Leadership Council. So first we'll hear from Dr. James Walker, I should say. Then from Greg Fitz-Gerald. And where's Keith Achepohl? I must be looking right at him. And he's hiding behind him over there. And then next from Keith Achepohl. So I don't want to take the time that they could spend in teaching you about their wonderful objects. So first, we'll have Jim talk to us about his amazing maps. Without further ado.
Thank you. Well, I guess it is Jim, but I'm usually known as the old map guy in circles that I coordinate with. And I want to just say at the beginning that I have been acquiring maps for a very long period of time, maybe as long as I practiced medicine. But it's really due to, I think, in large part to Barbara's support and passion for my interest in maps that really it's put together as a collection. So just with that acknowledgement, I will just acknowledge Barbara's great help in collecting. And say it louder. What really grabs me about old maps, and really what informs my collecting now, is what maps have to say about what happens in the society that produced them. It's about transmitting ideas, concepts, and beliefs of the society that generates the maps. It's about what happens in everyday life, if you will. And it's both about geographical information and about non-geographical information. So the idea that maps will tell a story is what I had in mind when I put together these four maps in front, which I would like to think tell the story of what I call the cartographic roots of manifest destiny, a term that really didn't appear on the scene until the 1840s, and these maps all represent a period of time from 1802 to 1822, but talk to us, if we interrogate them correctly, about the ways that Americans who lived east of the Mississippi became gradually acculturated to the idea of a continental expansion of the Americas from east to west. So I want to come back to that theme of cartographic roots of manifest destiny as I just say a few words about each individual map. And of course, I'm going to just focus on 2 or 3 points about each map, and then later on I'd be happy to answer specific questions if you're interested. This first large map was produced by a map maker in London named Aaron Arrowsmith, who was the most preeminent cartographer focusing on North America at that time, a London cartographer. And Arrowsmith published this map in 1802, which was the principal printed map used by Jefferson, Lewis, Clark, Gallatin, and others to support the idea of being able to find a navigable transcontinental water passage. That was the whole stated purpose, one of the stated purposes of the Lewis and Clark expedition, this fabulous Northwest Passage, in this case across the continent through navigable water passages. And so on the map, we see kind of what was known about the American Republic here, east of the Mississippi, the maritime Pacific Ocean, travels of Vancouver and Cook have been published, and that all looks pretty familiar. It's this huge interior emptiness, and of course it wasn't empty. It was populated by thousands and thousands of Native Americans who were essentially mapped out by being left off the map. But if you look closely later, you can see little dotted lines that extend from the upper reaches of the Missouri to named peaks in this conceptualized Rocky Mountains, a single little range of mountains. And then you can see little dotted lines extending west from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. These were the conjectural river systems that ran across the continent that had not yet been explored, but Jefferson implored and mandated Lewis and Clark to explore. And I think one of the interesting things about this map is the sources of information on this map. I mentioned the sources here and the sources here, but these river systems, conjectural river systems, that so stimulated the formulation of the Lewis and Clark expedition, that information was generated by 3 Blackfeet Indians who gave the information to a Hudson's Bay operative, Peter Fiddler, who was operating up in this area, transmitted it back to London, and it appeared on the map. It's a bitter irony in a way that that's the way the information came across. And of course, the Indian information was on ephemeral materials, which was then incorporated in a European style into this map. And this 1802 map was one of the few that was carried by Lewis and Clark on the expedition, was used by them, and has become justifiably famous in European American literature, and perhaps for opposite reasons in Native American literature as well. This idea of a single range of mountains and a fairly simple appearing river system was then transformed when this map was published, the map that appeared in the first English edition of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1814, 8 years after they returned. And this is one of the few maps that I think could really be called transformative. I mean, it really transformed the image of the American West. So the single little line of Rocky Mountains now appear as this very complex series of ridges and valleys. The simple river systems, now a complex hydrography of the Columbia and Snake River systems. I mean, it really transformed the way people thought about the West. It was also a geopolitical document, but because, of course, it became used and reused as a preeminent reason why America should assume dominion over this very complex area, because it was explored by Americans. But it's these 2 maps that I think really focus for me on the idea of a manifest destiny, of an idea that at some time in the future of the American Republic, it would be a continental republic. So this was done in 1816 by Philadelphia map maker John Mellish. When he died in 1820, this Henry Tanner in Philadelphia became the preeminent map maker of North America, United States, and this map was published in 1822. So contextually, in 1816, 1822, there were essentially 4 nations, imperial nation states, who had sovereignty rights in the Pacific Northwest, the United States, of course, Great Britain, Russia, and Spain. There were also Native American communities who, as I said, had been mapped out, who justifiably could claim sovereignty in the United States. They weren't part of this discussion. But at the time, in 1816, 1822, if you were to go up to a man in the street in this country and say, well, what do you think about expanding the American Republic west of the Mississippi to settle out west? Half of the people would say, well, where's that? Other half would say, well, I'm not really sure the geography. There would be very little discussion. It was like kind of thinking about populating the moon. So there are very few people at this time in the first 2 to 3 decades of the 19th century who knew very much or had very much of an opinion about continental expansion in the United States. There were a few statesmen, there were a few congressmen, very few newspaper editors, but there were map makers. And this map by John Mellish in 1816 is regarded as the first map to portray an image with no legal justification, an image of a continental United States. And Mellish, in an accompanying memoir to these maps, which is important to read, and not much has been written about these memoirs, Mellish said that he wanted to portray, quote, the vast extent of the United States country from coast to coast, quote. And he did that by the usual ways we think about map making, by all these different lines which show all the current states in the United States, by putting a border along the 49th parallel, roughly along the parallel, to accommodate tributaries of the Columbia River system and the Missouri River. And he extended it to the Gulf of Georgia, just essentially encapsulating much of the continent into the United States. In 1816, a time when there had not yet been one international negotiation between the United States, Spain, Great Britain, and Russia about international boundaries. In fact, this map was quite inflammatory. The British wrote that this map, if it incorporated if it represented American interest in a 49th parallel boundary, would deny them access to the Columbia River at 46 degrees. They produced a secondary map in response to this. There was international reaction to this. Mellish was a correspondent with Jefferson, who had a chance to look at this map before it was published. He was one of the founders of the American Philosophical Society. He's a member of the French Philosophical Society, et cetera. He was very influential, and there were 25 editions of this map that were published over the next 20 years, and it became a fundamental map for drawing up treaty negotiations with numerous countries during the time. So very important, but it was a very much of a geopolitical statement, a patriotic statement about what the extent of the United States should be. It should be continental, it's imperial, everybody else be damned and be out, etc. In 1822, Henry Tanner published this great map of North America, in which he even more boldly asserted the idea that the United States should assume continental proportions. He did this in several ways. One is he eliminated a boundary extending from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast, and he said in a memoir, you know, we really shouldn't put a boundary there because it's possible that through extended negotiations and maybe even conflict with Great Britain, our boundary will be somewhere else, might even be higher than 49 degrees. He used a map-making technique that I thought was very clever, and that is this wash color of yellow. At that time, many people who were objecting in print to the idea of extending the American Republic to the west were objecting to it because of geographical reasons. It's too far, it looks so foreign, it doesn't look like the rest of the country, it's remote, etc. And Tanner, as your eye slides across this yellow here on the map, you have the sense that there's this contiguity of lands, that it isn't all that difficult to think about being in one place and not being in another. It's a very much of a political statement, this map. It's unabashedly patriotic. And here this wonderful cartouche down at the bottom, if you have a chance to look at it, the Natural Bridge of Virginia, Niagara Falls, there's an eagle, a rattlesnake, a moose, all these objects that are very familiar. Tanner uses longitude west of Washington instead of west of London on the Mellish map. In this corner he has a scale of, quote, American miles, quote, to getting from place to place. I mean, this is truly in-your-face patriotic statement. And one of the things that affects all of us in the Pacific Northwest that I find most interesting about this map, and that up until recently had never been talked about, and if you have a chance to come up later, is his use of names. It's an incredible cartographic technique, and naming is an extremely important fundamental asset of cartographers. And I like to quote Wallace Stegner, who said once that a place cannot be understood, much less occupied, until it's been given a name. The name is the first stage in assuming identity and appropriation of a place, cartographic appropriation, and then feet on the ground. And in 1822, when there was not one American living in the Pacific Northwest, the only people living here were Native Americans and operatives of the Hudson's Bay Northwest Company, Tanner uses the term on this map, Oregon Territory. He's the first one to pick the word Oregon and apply it to a place, to a region, to give it a name, an American name. First one on a map. And he appropriated that name from a congressional document that had been published just 6 months before. So if there's ever an argument for a map becoming a geopolitical statement with geopolitical information that was just as important as geographical information, this is the map. It's an incredibly important map. And I will just say one other thing about the map here before I open this up, and that is that in the next edition of this map, 1825, 3 years later, Tanner, at 5440 degrees, establishes a boundary between the United States and Great Britain possessions. And the reason he did that may be a little convoluted, but he did it nevertheless, 1825. That was the first map by an American mapmaker to show a 5440 boundary. And from 1825 to 1846, when our current boundary between the United States and Canada at 49 degrees was established, for those years, virtually every mapmaker in North America who published a map in North America used the 5440 boundary. I mean, this was an incredibly important introductory idea, and that means every school child for 4 generations who read maps would be exposed to this idea of this is where the boundary should be. And we're all familiar with the term 5440 or fight that was near the Polk presidency, but the cartographic roots of that started back here as early as 1825.
What does that mean?
Sorry?
What does that mean,
54, so this parallel is 49 degrees. That's our current boundary with Great Britain. In all the negotiations with Great Britain during the international boundary agreements, the United States, for the most part, only argued for a 49th degree boundary. This is what they wanted to have, and the British, as I said, didn't want to have that because it would prevent them from using the Columbia River at 46 degrees. But Russia had ceded interest in 1824 to any commercial activity or settlement activity below 5440 degrees, which is way up here in current British Columbia. And so Tanner and others interpreted that agreement with Russia as being reason enough to propose that our boundary with Great Britain should be much higher than 49 degrees, 5440. So it appeared on all these maps, 5440, but 5440 was never a boundary that ever appeared in any document related to international discussions between Great Britain and the United States. Very interesting. Map makers took great amount of license, and I guess my main point here is that there's a lot more, and the thing that's stimulating to me is a lot more information to be gained from interrogating these maps than just geographical information, and non-geographical information about society, about what the society values, even at the expense of other societies like Native American societies, cultural beliefs, ambitions, all of that are embedded in these maps and are important to extract from them. So I think I'll stop at that and just open up. If I have if you have a few questions, I'd be happy to.
So who had access to these? Did they get distributed to governments? Could an individual acquire one in some way?
So I've written about the Tanner map, so I can answer that a little more specifically about the Tanner map. So this 1822 map, Tanner, for a year ahead of time, put out advertisements in virtually every newspaper on the East Coast for subscriptions to these. So you would have the opportunity to meet an agent and subscribe and get the map when you were there. But within 2 months after it was published, we have records that Henry Clay and 2 or 3 others in Congress bought these maps. The Library of Congress was mandated by the Library of the Senate to buy a copy of the map. Other map makers picked up Tanner's information, and the same year Fielding Lucas, another American map maker, published an atlas with a far greater distribution than this map, in which he adopted Tanner's nomenclature, including Oregon Territory. The distribution of these things was pretty widespread to a variety of people with a variety of means. It wasn't inexpensive. This map was initially published to be sold separately, as my example is. It was also in an atlas, and they were fairly expensive for the time. But the derivatives of the map with the same terminology and use of words was used by many others. The Lewis and Clark book, there were only 1,400 copies of this book that were made. Maybe 1,100 had maps. It was not a bestseller by the time 1814 came around. People's interest in Lewis and Clark had kind of waned. He was left with about 200 copies he couldn't sell, Clark. And of course, that's all changed over the years. The firm of Arrowsmith who made this map was lost during the Blitzkrieg. All the records in London were lost during the Blitzkrieg. So the records of this and the sale records or so are lost, and we don't know the answer to that. Yes?
Yes, right above the map, right above you, it says American Art. And since there was no GPS, what was the state of cartographic science at this time, and to what degree are these actual works of art?
Well, there are 2 questions embedded in that. This is, of course, in the latter period of the Age of Enlightenment. Surveying techniques were, superb for determining longitude and latitude, etc. So the ability to, to accurately, and I use that word without a great deal of pleasure. I don't like the word accurate when applied to maps, but as we look at this, we recognize the coastline looks very accurate. This is because the maritime voyages at Cook and Vancouver were done with triangulation on land when they were done, and so they very accurately plotted this. And similarly over here. all of the Lewis and Clark expedition was more of a reconnaissance than anything else. They lost instruments, they had instruments, but they were on meandering rivers. And one of the problems that took such a long time for Clark's map to be published is that they could not true up the longitudes that Clark brought back on his wonderful manuscript map with what was known about other longitudes east and west. And so, I mean, partly answer your question, how accurate was the surveying? Was quite inaccurate with the Lewis and Clark expedition. By the time we get over here a little bit later, 1816, 1822, there was a lot more mapping material. I didn't mention, but these maps incorporated much material other than Lewis and Clark. Pike, Humboldt, a guy named Drouillard, John Coulter, the Astorians, all had given information to Clark, which he accumulated on this, and he was able to true up these kinds of information. The only thing I'll mention on this map, just to be complete, is this incorporates all the Lewis and Clark information, Pike information, lots of Native American information in this map too. Lewis and Clark did not have knowledge of the upper reaches of the Columbia River, the upper reaches of the Willamette River, a lot of the river systems out the Continental Divide, but he had many, many transcriptions of Indian roots information that still survive at Beinecke Library in Yale. You can look at them online in high res, and he incorporated all that Native American information in that map as well. So oh, okay, good.
So I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
in order to keep on track, obviously we have a great deal of knowledge and passion represented in each of our collectors, so please feel free to come up and ask them questions afterward if they would be so kind. And I think with that, we'll proceed to Greg Fitz-Gerald, who I think will begin talking
Over here, but can we let the guy with the AA has a process by which you stand up, give your name, and then what you are. Well, my name is Greg Fitz-Gerald, and I'm a collector. There is no 12-step program that's going to stop me. I don't want one. It's a delight, it's a happiness in the life of my wife and myself. Unlike Jim and I think Keith, who are much more scholarly about what they do and everything, I'm just a flat old collector of stuff. And part of it is the hunt. When we're on traveling or whatnot, and as you also get to know the artists, I get into artists' studios. We collect almost exclusively contemporary art. Though there's a couple of one piece in particular that dates to 600 AD, but it has a contemporary story behind it. And that is the fun of collecting, is the story, getting to know it, the hunt. The disease started with contemporary Japanese ceramics. And almost all what we have is a vessel in one form or another, often a functional piece. But as I started learning about Japanese art, one of the first things that appealed to me, as well as tied to my background where I'm a mechanic, I love mechanical things, I love craftsmanship. That's incredibly important. And the Japanese will pick up a pot, the first thing they do is they look at the bottom and say, if the artist didn't care enough about the part that doesn't show as he does about the part that does show, he doesn't count. Just throw it away. And then as I began to learn a little bit more, negative space. And I think we've all heard that term. What the heck is negative space? How does negative space make art? This, to me, is the ultimate illustration of negative space. 6 black pots, which are just sort of pretty standard black pots. But if you look at what's in between the black pots, okay, you all over here are going to have a terrible time seeing it. There's a little card over here that helps on it. There are silhouettes of men in here. And it starts over here, young, good posture, weight control, changes directions, and by the time it gets over here, it's more like me. Gained weight, his posture's not so good. Now, the craftsmanship of putting this together and figuring out how to have two sides, because he just takes a rib, that produce an image inside empty space, to me, illustrates better negative space than anything I've ever seen. I've got some Chinese paintings where 80% of them are empty, and it shows an illustration, but boy, this really does it. And does anybody not see the people? Okay, so when we have this displayed at home, we don't have it displayed anywhere near as well as this, and we have a lot of fun saying, oh, but it's there, believe me. And so, you know, that is sort of the beginnings of this. Are there questions here? Because then we're going to move over to the other side. Yeah.
Is this handling of negative space characteristic of this particular artist? Or
Yeah, this artist, he's a professor of art up in Canada and has the luxury of teaching. I contacted him recently because I wanted to try to get an updated value on this. And he doesn't show it in any galleries. You know, that's an artist's true luxury. And he says, well, I'll make you a piece if I feel like it. And he makes some more pieces and everything. But he makes big pieces that are life-size. The ones at the show, I bought this at the Sofa show in New York a number of years ago. And he had a couple of pieces about this size that had the silhouette of a baby in it. And they were just wonderful. He's doing some other works now that are abstractions with curves and whatnot, but again, you know, just a conceptual shape illustrating negative space. Any other questions, or we can, yeah.
If he sells them as the set, that is
Yeah.
worth part of the total. It's like he's not going to sell
Right.
one pot.
And they are numbered, because it does require that they be in particular order. And so the folks who put it in installation here started with 1 over here and got to 6 over here. As I came in the gallery today and first looked at it, I said, oh my golly, it's backwards. Because when I displayed it at home, I had 1 over here and went this direction. Now, but you know, it works either way. So should we wander down and see some more craftsmanship? Again, this is an illustration of collecting and of my interest, particularly in craftsmanship. This pot, as you look at it, if you get down and see the light, there's a pot inside the pot. And the shape on the inside in Korean is called maebyeong. These are contemporary Korean that I'm going to talk about. Probably revered as the greatest aesthetic beauty of a pot that you can have in Korea. So he throws a big pot, cuts it open, opens it up, throws the middle pot, sticks it inside, and then puts them back together. And then with an X-Acto knife, cuts out all the matrix. The failure rate is huge. The craftsmanship, it just blows my mind that somebody can do this. I think these kinds of pots, there's some that are machine-made now that are on the market, but these, probably the artists are going to give up doing them because it's just too darn hard. And but it illustrates what, again, for our collecting is a key. I went through a period of making pots. Not that I got very good at making pots, but I sure understood better what I was collecting. And I think anybody who collects, you know, if you've made paints and paintings or something, and then you collect paintings, you'll understand what's going on a whole lot more. The other pot, which is on the side, which you really can't see from this side, but I encourage you afterwards, the painting on the other side. He is a Korean master hands of porcelain, which is a Korean sort of equivalency to Living National Treasure that the Japanese have. I was at his studio. He's an older man. He had some patrons from Seoul there. He was in the middle of a firing. And I'm looking at this one pot. And it was really pretty and it was nice. But he sort of sensed that I knew what I was doing. He came over and said, no, that's number 3 pot. You should have number 1 pot. A very, very similar pot. Same price. Number 3 pot was gorgeous until I saw number 1 pot. And that's the mystery of art. You know, if you just looked at it quickly and everything, you say, what's the difference between these two? It's like a Japanese tea bowl that when you hold it in your hands, if the weight's right, the colors, everything else, you just know it's right. You know, you can come up with all sorts of analogies about when you just know intuitively something is right. Well, number 1 pot was absolutely exquisite. This is number 1 pot. It's got painting on it, so not only is he a very good craftsmanship because the glaze, and a problem with museums, especially with ceramics, you can't touch them, is the glaze on that is almost soft. It's a recreating of a glaze that was used about 800 years ago in Korea. It's just so smooth, it's so matte finish, it's just luscious, and that's what makes that. I'm not supposed to talk about other people's pots, but this pot over here is absolutely, it's Korean, it's a contemporary Korean piece. I've seen that artist's work in Seoul, never have bought it. It is, you know, the Gagnes have that. It's an absolutely exquisite piece. And then to move over, again, the fun of collecting, of getting to know people. This is Shilla Dynasty, in a period in Korea. It dates about 600 AD. And some of you may remember that 5-6 years ago, we had an exhibition of the #1 calligrapher from Korea, Jung-do Jun. He was here. My wife was born in Korea, was adopted to America, to Brownsville, Oregon, and works with Holt International for Korea a lot. So they're here. We had they gave the obligatory, well, next time you're in Seoul, give us a call. Yeah, sure, fine. Well, in fact, we have developed an incredible friendship. And my potter's name in Japanese is Soho. His potter's name in Korean, he didn't make this pot, but his artist name for his calligraphy is Sohan. So Soho, Sohan, we're brothers. I'm older brother, he's younger brother. We just have this friendship that's incredible. We go over, we see him, and was over there and in his apartment, and he said, at just getting out his collection of these Shilla Dynasty, they'd moved to a new place. He said, which one do you like? And without thinking, I said, I like that one. And he said, well, then you take it, older brother. And I said, no, absolutely not, can't do this. Forgetting that in Asia, you know, if you admire something, you better be prepared. And so then he's getting upset, and I'm thinking, oh my God, we got an international incident coming. Because the American is being rude once again. And we're talking about it and everything, and I said, well, no, you know, I don't have any room in my carry-on. Well, okay, you bring it. No, I can't bring it. Finally, I said, well, wait, younger brother. It is so beautiful, it belongs with these other pots. I will leave it here, and you take care of it for me. It will be mine. That seemed to work, and I thought, by golly, I must have been Asian in an earlier life after all, you know, or certainly diplomat and all. This is great, until he said that he was going to have a show in New York of his calligraphy. We said, well, we'll meet you there and come to the opening and all. We get there, they've been so kind to us. What are we going to do? Well, we took them all out to a very fancy restaurant for dinner. We've got our J.C. Penney gift that we give them, because in Asia, gift giving is just out of control. So our little gift, we give it to them, and they reach under the table and pull out this box. My wife nudges me and says, it's the pot. And I said, it can't be. Well, sure enough, it's the pot. And so, but you know, that's the fun of collecting, the fun of being in part of an area and stuff. We have stories like this. It adds so much to our enjoyment and our pleasure of this pot. We're not particularly scholars about it. I'm not trying to assemble a museum collection or anything. If I don't like a Jones or my wife doesn't like a Jones, we won't buy a Jones. If we like a Smith, we'll buy 10 Smiths. So we're entirely different collectors than you'll encounter with many other collectors. We're not going to walk down, but over in the Chinese room, there are 2 pieces that are from our collection also. One looks like a bamboo teapot. In fact, it's made out of clay. There's another little bowl that looks like it's a piece of birch bark that's all been carved, or birch wood with bark on it. It's clay. And the one that's the bowl is a contemporary artist who is becoming very, very recognized. Nobody else can, well, one other guy in Taiwan who was his teacher can do the kind of work he's doing, but I've not seen it anywhere else. And again, it's craftsmanship, just incredible craftsmanship. So I'm going to stop. Questions, stories, jokes, anything? Don't leave me up here dying.
So you said that this, I have 2 questions about the piece you were just talking about. One is the gauge, and the second is, are you saying that he just literally gave it to you
Yeah,
as a gift?
just as a gift. And it is 600 AD. And it's not, I mean, it's expensive, but it's not that expensive, because there are a lot of these pots. There's also a lot of forgeries now. And coming from him, it's authentic.
Thrown on a wheel, or do you know, or can you imagine, or how it was made?
I'm pretty sure this was thrown.
It's not oil.
No, it's thin enough and all that. I'm pretty sure, but I'm not certain. I just haven't, I just love the design. I love the shape. I love to live with it. I don't much worry about how it was made. Other people would really get into it, dig into the glazing and everything else. That's just not something we do. Yes?
Does a collection of ceramics like this require special care, differences of humidity?
Happily, clay is very, very durable. And it doesn't require much other than being careful when you handle it. And we handle them a lot because that's part of clay, especially, for example, the Japanese tea ceremony and the tea bowl. It's meant to be used, it's meant to be touched, it's meant to break. And unlike paintings where the sun and everything, I mean, ultimately, if you have something with a low-fired pot with lots of color in it and put it in a bright sun window, it will deteriorate. But you've seen pottery shards from the Egyptians and everything else. If you want real weirdness of a collector, we collect ceramics. I've been very, very hesitant to collect glass because it's breakable. Go figure. I can't begin to explain that one. Yes.
Other than Korean, do you have an interest?
Yeah, I mean, it's the disease started with contemporary Japanese. I couldn't collect old Korean because there's very little out and it's very, very expensive. Now that we go to Korea, I can meet the contemporary artists, buy them. But as I said before, this is, what I have is a disease for which there's no vaccine. And like all diseases, it mutates. So I've put together a collection of contemporary European raku. There's some incredible work in raku being done in Europe now. I went through a period of contemporary Chinese landscape paintings. Interestingly, in China, they call contemporary anything after 1851. And these are very traditional, old-style landscape. We have Japanese furniture, some stickly reproductions. When my wife and I first started dating, she asked me a question I'd never been asked in my life, and that was, what is your real passion? And without thinking, it just came out and I said, beauty. And I sort of surprised myself, because I was a kid who grew up, thought he was going to be a professional baseball player. But that's sort of the thread of just beautiful things. So our disease will mutate from time to time. Over in the low corner here, the Chinese painting of the farm workers, that's a piece my wife bought. And it reminds her very much, on a good day, what her life in Korea would have been had she not been adopted to America. So again, it's a beautiful painting, but to us, it means a lot. And Rose, are you working for the museum? I mean, it's a very legitimate question, and part of it has been that it's a storehouse of value that we get to live with. Have children, have grandchildren. I have over the years, I mean, anybody who ever says I'm collecting for investment is really crazy, because you buy at retail and you sell at wholesale. So if I, when Roadshow was here, if I sell a piece to you for what they say it's worth, I can't afford to buy it back 5 minutes later, because I've sold at wholesale. So part of this is a storehouse of value. It will go to my children. My daughter, my youngest daughter, has said, those 6 pieces down with the silhouettes in them, those are hers. And the other 2 kids have backed off. We may donate some. I haven't gotten that far, much more than knowing that we're just buying it for today's enjoyment. But certainly we lend it. We lend our pieces a lot.
How did you get interested in Asia in particular? I mean, if you were going to be a professional baseball player, one of the denominators I see here is Asia. So
yeah, I mean that's just sort of chance, but also, you know, the Northwest is the gateway to Asia, has had tremendous Asia. But I was living in New York, so I was starting to do business. I put together some business in Hong Kong with Chinese, had all sorts of briefings of how do you negotiate, what do you need to culture and everything. And then I put together a strategy dealing in Japan. Same kind of brief. That aesthetic just hooked me. Why? I mean, how do you catch the flu? I don't know, but I caught it. And but when I started, actually I started on cowboy art because I grew up in Kansas, was a little familiar with it, and it happened late in my life. I grew up with no art or anything, and then the Chinese have a wonderful saying that I just love because it reflects my life. When the pupil is ready, the teacher shall appear. And I wasn't ready until the late 70s. And then it was my time. I was doing business in Asia. I began to look at it. I was getting these briefings, and it just clicked. And as I say, I don't want it to stop. You know.
I brought two things which you can pass around. This is the catalog that the Art Institute did of my collection. 3 pieces of which are here. In fact, that one at the end is on the cover. So you can quickly thumb through it to get some idea. The other book is one I'll talk a little bit about. It's by James Kuno, who happens to be a graduate of this university. He's now head of the Getty in California, and he's written a couple of the most interesting and provocative books about, as this one is called, Whose Culture, in which he's talking about who does all this stuff that we collect belong to, really? Is it ours, or is it as I think? And the reason I love reading his books is he thinks it belongs to everybody. And what we are is the carriers from one point in time to another. And that's been the background of all my collecting. Come through it quickly. 2 things have dictated who and what I am. One is I was born in Chicago. And still love Chicago. It's still my primary place of thought. The other is I can't remember a time when I was not making art. So I'm an artist collector in that sense. I had a grandmother who lived with us who, from my early teens, took me to the Art Institute of Chicago at least once a month. And that meant I grew up with great art and could never get it out of my system. And I remember the day that we were looking at Le Grand Jatte, Seurat's great painting, and I noticed the label. And it said, Helen Birch Bartlett Collection. Helen Birch Bartlett was a great collector. And I said, what does that mean, Grandma? And she said, that means that Helen Birch Bartlett and her husband collected a lot of really great art and decided sometime maybe they'd live with it long enough and they should give it to the Art Institute of Chicago. And that triggered something in my head, which I've never forgotten. And that meant, as James Kuno is pointing out, it's yours for a while. Then let other people look at it and enjoy it and keep that thing going on. I went to graduate school at the University of Iowa. Before that, we were living in Elmhurst, Illinois, directly west of Chicago, which was a phenomenal little place to grow up because I had 2 teachers in 7th and 8th grade who were phenomenal and encouraged me to make art. And in high school, I had, again, a great high school, York High School, where I had a Latin teacher, and I sat in her Latin room for 4 years. I can still recite the Aeneid in Latin, as well as a few prayers to the gods, which I have to do once in a while. And that room was filled with statues of Greek and Roman goddesses. There was a Parthenon in the back. There were all kinds of photographs of Greek pottery. She instilled in me the idea that I simply had to get to Europe. because she lived between where we lived and the high school, and she would invite me to come in. From her, I learned how to make peanut brittle, how to make marzipan candies, and she would always talk about the trips to Scandinavia and to the Mediterranean. So I did get to Europe and started. All the trips that I've taken in my life have never been to find scenery. They've really all been pilgrimages, to go from one great museum to another. So my life has been spent in museums. And I always look at the labels. Who gave it? So I know about the Wideners, and I know about the Rothschilds. I know about all those great collectors who, as Kuno said, had the art for a while and enjoyed it while they were alive, and then decided other people should enjoy it. After teaching a bit at Iowa, I moved to Tacoma, and I taught at Pacific Lutheran University for a couple of years. Had a show in the Fountain Gallery, Arlene Schnitzer's gallery in Portland. That's where I bought my first African piece. Beautiful mask that I still have. So Arlene Schnitzer started it. I was then invited back to Iowa, where I stayed for 40 years and kept teaching until I moved out here a few years ago. When I got back to Iowa, they had a beautiful new museum, and a couple of Iowa donors gave 2 big collections of African art to the museum, along with money to start an African studies program, which became one of the best in the country. So I had access to people who could tell me about African art. And early on, then when I went back there, I went to Chicago one day and came across a gallery, Douglas Dawson Gallery, that had a show of African pottery. And I was astonished, because here were these great pots. And I didn't see them as pots. I didn't see them as anything except great sculpture. I'm a two-dimensional artist. Everything I do is basically flat, on paper, on canvas, whatever. And so suddenly to be confronted with these three-dimensional objects which had such incredible power and such incredible presence, made by women in a time when everybody was wondering, don't women make art? Art museums weren't showing women's art. These were made by women, not on a wheel. They're all hand-built. And as the catalog says, it's hearth and altar, which meant that they're all useful objects, either useful in terms of putting water in them or grain or something like that, or to be put on the altar. So they serve 2 basic purposes. The inventiveness of them is what totally got me. I mean, they're fucking beautiful. And they represent everything in their culture. I mean, the animals that they live with, these little water creatures, these little animals that look like they're hugging that vase for dear life, or pieces like this, which cowrie shells. There's a little altar here. I mean, that's incredible. And this one just came back from the Louvre. There was a show traveling around the world, and that was in it. But again, this evocative face that is howling at you. I mean, they're so human. Also, they're human forms. There's the belly of the pot, there's the foot of the pot, there's the neck of the pot. You know, it's all talking about human form, made of the simplest material on earth called clay. It's really crazy. Well, I started collecting this stuff. I went in and bought 1 pot. 2 weeks later, I went back and bought 2, and it kept going on for 30 years. About 20 years into that, I had something major happen in my life. I had my first bout with cancer, and I decided I had needed to think about what was going to happen to this stuff. So shortly before that time, the university had a major conference on African pottery, and so my collection went to the museum, and they did it, and people looked at it. People from around the country looked at it, including the then curator of African art at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we started discussing things. And I said, would you like the collection? And they said, well, we should do a show. So it took 10 years. She came out, looked at it, and then James Wood, the director of the Art Institute, came out and looked and said, yes, we must do something with this. So through a lot of planning, a time was set, which was, I think, a 3 or 4 year period which meant I had 3 or 4 more years to get more pots. Because at that point, in discussing with them, I wanted to put together the most comprehensive exhibit, most comprehensive collection of pottery representing all of Africa. And with Doug's help, and by that time other dealers knew what I was doing, so they were coming to me. I didn't have to go to them. Or I'm usually in Venice every July, and so I'd find a pot in Venice, and then you could carry it on your arms coming home on the airplane. It was really easy. Travel used to be wonderful. And there were other dealers who dealt in other things, and it got to the point where I could trade my work for that work. And of course, when I started collecting these, no one was collecting them. That was the other. Sometimes it's the wonderful thing about collecting. If you have the wherewithal to get in on something in its infancy, as I was, I mean, that time there was not one pot at the Metropolitan Museum. Hardly any museum in the country was showing African pottery. So I was able to get the best of what was there. Doug would call me and say, oh, a shipment is coming in this weekend. You want to be here? Well, of course I'd drive into Chicago. And I'd be there when we'd open up these crates with this gorgeous stuff. And I had first crack at the best pottery coming into America. And by then, there were no books yet on this stuff. So there was no research as the Juns could do. I mean, I just couldn't do that because the books had yet to be written. This is the Bible for African pottery now. And at a certain point, once we decided what areas still needed to be gotten, if it was possible, then a time finally for the exhibit was set, and they showed me where the exhibit would be in the Art Institute. And then it took a while for all this to go. And when you're dealing with a museum like the Art Institute of Chicago, things take time. So they took their time, but produced this, which started out being, it was going to be a little pamphlet. But then as the collection grew, they knew that it was getting beyond what the original conception of it was all about. And then they started sending the photographers out to photograph everything at my place, and then they invited me to come back to the Art Institute to go through the catalog, see how I liked it. We made suggestions. It was one of the most enervating and exhilarating experiences I've ever had, being totally involved in the production of this. But then they really surprised me by realizing that their main exhibition space at the Art Institute had a hole in it. And so the exhibit was moved to their central exhibition space, and they put up the most beautiful exhibit I could ever imagine. And I didn't know about that until the day I arrived for the opening. So it was pretty glorious. And the very first thing I decided was that they could keep whatever they wanted, because it was my home institution. The Art Institute already has one of the best collections of Asian art, Asian ceramics. They have pre-Columbian ceramics. They have great ceramics from everywhere, but they didn't have African. So the understanding was with the African, they could, whenever they wanted now, mount a collection of great ceramics from all over the world. And I love that idea. This is only one of my collections. I have 3 others. But this one, I think, was the most important and continues to be. And even since that exhibit was up, I've acquired this one and this one, so they're not in that. No, that one's in it. This one is not. And this is one of my favorite because I love the sense of the human form. I mean, we don't think of ceramics necessarily being human form. Pre-Columbian has a lot of human form, of course, in it. But African art is probably the second one that deals with a lot of African form. It's the tactile quality of them and the idea that you really are looking at human beings. They just happen to be assuming in their other life another form made of ceramic, you know, and then that kind of transformation to me has always been remarkable and a really beautiful thing. So much of it is dictated, of course, by the region of Africa. Different regions of Africa produce different kinds of clay. So that will determine what is happening. And of course, so many of them are ceremonial, as this one and this one. And sometimes the ceremonial pots are made by the men, but almost, we can usually say almost always by women in their various regions of Africa. So, any questions? I mean, I could go on forever, but I better not.
Why? Why are women making the pottery?
Well, I mean, they're around the hearth. The men are off hunting and doing things men do. Women can make pots, and women know kind of what they need to do, what they need for storage of what is at the hearth, which is like hearth and altar. Yes.
I understand that you're a pretty famous artist in your own right, and I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about how this collection has informed your own work, or vice versa, how your
I love
aesthetic.
surfaces of things, and the surfaces of these are so extraordinary. You know, they're not just dull, smooth surfaces. It's the work of the hand. You know, we have three things. I talk about this all the time. We're possessed of three powerful things. We have minds, we have hearts, we have hands. That's all artists need. And we use them in different ways. Sometimes we figure out something intellectual that we can then figure out through our feelings of something we can then produce with our hands. Well, that's one of the miracles of being an artist. It's one of the miracles of being alive. You know, we all do that. You know, I mean, to me, cooking is an art as much as gardening is an art. But they all require those three things: thinking, feeling, doing. It's pretty simple. And in that respect, it feeds into me. I mean, when I'm out in my studio, you know, once in a while I need a break. I can go weed for 15 minutes and feel damn good. I've weeded, you know. Or I come home from the studio, I turn on some Bach or someone else and start cooking, you know, put the music on and start cooking. It's all part of the same thing. I haven't been able to separate the parts of my life because it's one life. I'm not many people. It's interesting how the different collections I have siphon off different feelings about different things. But this is the one that is most powerful because I think these are such powerful objects. And of course, part of it was I started collecting, and I have masks and I have other pieces. But when I started collecting these things, you know, a mask would start costing you $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, $150,000. I couldn't buy that. In fact, one of the other collections is prints. And when I was in graduate school, a man named, there was a company called Ferdinand Roten coming out of Baltimore. He would travel around with portfolios of old master prints to universities and put them out in bins, and we could buy them. And I think I bought a Goya for $60. So I could buy those, but I was really realizing that even that was expensive for me in graduate school. So I was living in a little apartment. There were 4 apartments above a shoe store. We called it fondly Cockroach Arms for obvious reasons. And the 3 other tenants asked if I would cook for them. So 3 nights a week I cooked for them, and with the money that I made from cooking, I could buy old master prints. And that started a pattern that I've used forever. My wife was wonderful, and we had an agreement that whatever I made teaching fed the family. She could run the house, the family. What I made from my art, I bought art with. And that's how I've been buying art all my life. Yes?
These were all used for ceremonial purposes, right?
Not all.
Utilitarian or very...
No, one or the other. You know, that would have been a food bowl, probably. And this one, too, would have been food or water. These others, obviously, they're not useful in the sense of being able to carry food or anything like that, so they would have been ceremonial.
Would they be put away then after...
Put away or kept on the altar. Often there would be altars in the home or in their larger communal dwellings. Yeah, it's both. Yes?
Both you and Greg have emphasized the tactile quality of these pots, and I'm sure you've given this thought, but if you give the collection to a museum, one of their cardinal rules is hands off, do not touch.
Well, then come to my house, you can touch the damn thing. No, when people come to my house, I say, touch it, love it. You know, love that thing. Yes.
When you first started acquiring your art, obviously there was not a great deal of difficulty in getting it out of the country. Has any of that changed over time?
It has changed, and in fact, some of the pots, some of the first ones, the Gen A pots, which are 13th, 15th century, the Art Institute at this point would not take them. They didn't want them. Some other institutions would. I don't think what I have are so very rare. It's just that I've been told the Art Institute is one of the fussiest museums in the world in terms of taking things and being sure about the provenance. Since the 70s, there have been a lot of laws. And that's what Kuno's book gets into. What archaeologists and historians don't like is when something comes on the market and they don't know exactly where it came from. If there's enough documentation that tells us that a certain site is where it came from, that's better. But when suddenly it appears on the market or is brought to you by a dealer, you don't know where it comes from. So those become problematic. And that's true of what we call the archaeological stuff, and that's what some of those pieces are. The other thing is now there are fakes. And it's one of the reasons I don't collect them anymore. Though Doug and I think we can pretty much tell. Also, they're horrendously expensive now. And but what we try to be careful about is who's importing them. The Art Institute did not want this one, though the Fowler Museum in California keeps writing me letters, please, please, will you donate it to us? Anyway, these two came into the country with what they think are false documents. In other words, the person bringing them in declared one value, but then for insurance and for donating he declared another value. Well, that's the kind of thing some museums are very sticky about. Others say we'll turn a blind eye to that. And my argument with the Art Institute was, well, you lose nothing by taking them. You might have to give them back, but you're getting them from me for nothing. And which means I'm now dealing with 2 other museums. I'm giving things to 4 different institutions at this point. So, because I don't want my kids to be stuck with that problem. Yes.
To the Halleck Ford Museum in Salem, and you had the most extraordinary collection of bags.
Well, that was Turkish weavings, yes. Nomad weavings.
Charming. They were utilitarian objects.
Yes, and that whole collection I've given to Iowa. Though I just gave 18 other pieces to the Halleck Ford. Another collection that had to get out of the house. Please.